Okay, right now we're going to talk about freshwater. Freshwater is described as having a low salt concentration. Usually this is less than 1% of salt. If we look at all the water in the world, 97.5% is salt water. Only 2.5% of the water in the earth is freshwater. And of that 2.5%, 79% of that is actually frozen. This is found in the ice caps and glaciers. So, of that 2.5% of freshwater, 20% of that is in the ground. This is groundwater filling the aquifers. Only 1% of the 2.5% of all the water in the earth is actually at the surface. And that surface freshwater would be lakes, rivers, streams, and even in the air as water vapor. So freshwater is a very small percent, and even a smaller percent that is easily accessible to us. Now, fresh water provides water for drinking. It provides sanitation, which means allowing you to clean things, providing clean drinking water, providing adequate sewage, sanitation. If our hands are dirty, we want to wash our hands with soap and water. So sanitation, it means making something clean. Freshwater also provides agriculture, an irrigation system. Irrigation refers to bringing water, a high resource of water, to an area that does not have water. So if I have crops or I want to plant my crops, but I'm not near a river or stream, I may create an irrigation system or a piping system to bring the water of a high amount to an area where I don't have a lot of water, an area of a low water source. Freshwater also provides transport. Not only can I have it for recreation like boating and water skiing and swimming, but we can use it for transport, and that's actually traveling on boats. Also, freshwater has been used as a means of generating electricity through hydroelectric power plants. And most importantly, it's a habitat for many different animals, fish, plants. So many different animals live in freshwater. Now, some terms you need to know, some terms you've learned before. The first one is erosion. Remember, erosion and weathering are different. Erosion is referring to the movement from point A to point B. So as rock particles in soil were weathered and broken down, they're being loosened, they get transported maybe by a stream or river to a different location. The second term, a load or bed load, is referring to a specific sediment that is carried by a stream or river. If we're talking about a bed load, it's carried at the bottom, the river bed. Deposition means dropping off particles. Particles are settling, perhaps on the side of the river or at the end of a river. Now, we've talked about watersheds before, but we haven't really talked about deltas or drainage basins. So a delta is actually the land area that's formed at the end of a river. So as we just talked about deposition, as a river is carrying all this sediment at the bed load, but also suspended inside, it then drops it off as it opens up into the ocean. And all this sand and mud gets dropped off and it starts piling up and up and up. And then it ends up actually creating land. Louisiana is slowly getting bigger because of the deposition of the Mississippi River. So you have this land being created. This is called a delta. So a delta is the land that is actually being formed at the end of the river. It's adding on to the other land that's there. Now, watersheds and drainage basins. A lot of people get this confused. This is a little confusing sometimes. But a watershed, we said, watersheds are going to drain from certain areas of the land, but it's going to connect and interconnect between streams making a river. Now, it can also drain and interconnect into a lake and drain into a lake. If it drains into a river, that is going to be called, now if that stream empties and drains into the ocean, that is going to be called an open watershed. One way to remember this is O for open, O for ocean. So if your interconnected streams and rivers that are draining from the land empty into the ocean, that's an open watershed. But if the watershed then empties into a lake, okay, a lake is confined, it's closed, that's a closed watershed. But a drainage basin is when ice and water perhaps comes from the mountains, and as it's draining down, it's draining from an area in which it's then draining and flowing from a high area. Make sure you know the water cycle. We talked about that last week. Make sure you know evapotranspiration, transpiration, condensation, evaporation, vaporization, precipitation, infiltration, percolation. If any of those words that I just described you don't recognize, make sure you look those terms up. Okay, let's first divide freshwater into two sections. The first one is going to be surface water. The second one we're going to talk about in just a little bit is groundwater. So let's talk about surface water first. Examples of surface freshwater are going to be your creeks, brooks, ponds, rivers, streams. These are your freshwater systems. Many animals, many fish, snakes, turtles, alligators, many insects such as flies and mosquitoes live in and around freshwater systems. So actually some insects that actually live on the outside or the banks of a lake or a river would still be considered freshwater animals. The three specific types of freshwater systems are streams and rivers, lakes and ponds, and wetlands. Now, streams and rivers are pretty much in the same category because it's just a smaller version. They are focused on the pattern of them being a body of water, a body of moving water that's confined in a narrow depression. And the focus here is that streams and rivers are moving in one direction, from point A to point B. Lakes and ponds are going to be a smaller version of the lakes. These are bodies of more standing water or non-moving water. While the wetlands are going to be slow or even non-moving water that's going to be covered with vegetation. So it's a very superficial or surface water. Now let's talk about streams and rivers. There are three types of streams that I need you to know. We've talked about some of these already. The first one is a straight stream. This is generally with or seen in a young river or young stream. Then we have a meandering or curved stream. And when we have the curved stream, on the outside of the curve, you have a lot of erosion. On the inside of the curve, you have a lot of deposition. Then the last type of stream is very easy to remember, especially through looking at the illustration, but this is a new type. This is called a braided or separated stream. Just like if someone braids your hair, they interconnect it, they weave it together. I don't really know too much about that, but I'm sure some of you young ladies have braided your hair before. Okay. Here are some illustrations of a straight stream, more of a young river. Then here we have the meandering, number 2, more of an old or maturing river. And then you have your braided or interconnected river at number 3. Okay, here's 2 terms that you do need to know. Actually, let's see here. Okay, here's 4 terms that you do need to know. The focus here is on the left, a stream's elevation profile. The elevation profile is basically describing how the stream changes elevation from the beginning to the end. Usually streams are going to be starting at a high point and then they end at a low point. That's all this is talking about. So an elevation profile, remember what elevation is? How high above sea level. So from point A to point B, how does it change? Now, here's a key term that you need to know. You can see steepness is underlined, but that's not necessarily what I want you to be aware of. I want you to know what the term for stream gradient is. Gradient. So a gradient describes steepness. So let me ask you a quick question. Does a waterfall have a high or low gradient? A waterfall has a high gradient. A flat stream that goes pretty much horizontal, would not have a lot of steepness. So this has a low gradient. So something that is very steep, pretty much going vertical up and down, like a waterfall, that would have a high gradient. Okay, now let's look at the third term, which is on the right paragraph, the stream's mouth. The mouth is the opening. This is where the river opens and flows into something. This can open and flow into the ocean. So at the end of the Mississippi River, the mouth flows into the ocean. Maybe the mouth of a stream flows into a lake or pond, or it can even connect and the mouth can open and flow into another stream. Now, most rivers flow horizontally near their mouth, usually having a gradient of 0 or no slope. This means that the stream is at its base level, which is usually sea level. Here you can see the Amazon River emptying into the Atlantic Ocean, so that opening is called the mouth. Now the Mississippi River, its mouth empties into the Gulf of Mexico. Now here's a picture at the bottom of the Niagara Falls, and so you can see, because it's a waterfall, it has a very steep gradient because it has a steep slope. It's very vertical up and down. Now let's move on to the more standing bodies of water, which are the lakes and ponds. Now lakes and ponds are very similar, but ponds are going to be smaller and more shallow. A lake, however, is going to usually be a lot larger, very deep, and lakes such as the Great Lakes, they're so large and so deep that most lakes don't have rooted plants at the bottom. And the reason why they don't have plants at the bottom is because plants need sunlight. And because they're so deep that sunlight can't reach the bottom of the lake, these plants can't perform photosynthesis and can't survive. So ponds, being more shallow, they can have plants at the bottom. Sunlight can reach these plants. Sunlight can reach these plants so they can grow. So lakes, now man-made lakes are actually called reservoirs. Some lakes are actually, some lakes were not actually there originally, but many times they were, maybe certain areas were flooded and then turned into a reservoir. There was, where I grew up in New York State, there was the town of Neversink. And in that area, in that town of Neversink, my grandfather actually was in charge of keeping the one-room schoolhouse warm. He had to start the fire and everything. He actually forgot about the fire one time, and the schoolhouse burnt down. But don't laugh. But they actually flooded that whole area later, and they turned that little area into a reservoir. And that reservoir actually provides clean drinking water to New York City. Okay, here's a term called eutrophication. Eutrophication is the depletion of oxygen in the lake. Well, what it's caused by? Well, what is it caused by? It's actually caused by an explosive growth of algae and plants. This algal bloom, which you can see at the bottom picture on the right-hand side, is just a mass production of algae. And the algae, when it dies, it drops to the bottom of the lake and produces toxins. These toxins then kill many, many fish in the lake and kills off other living things in the lake. And this algae not only produces toxins when it dies, but when it's alive, it depletes a lot of the oxygen. Here's an illustration. You can take a look at that. There are 3 types of wetlands. There's swamps, which consists of trees and bushes and shrubs. There are marshes, which consists of soft stem plants and grass, tall grasses. And there are bogs, which consists of mosses and some trees and shrubs, but generally it's going to be a pretty much a desolate wasteland of a high pH, a foul-smelling odor, and lots of moss. Now, if you ever saw Lord of the Rings, they were walking through a bog, and so this is generally going to be very high pH, lots of bacteria, smells very bad. Not a lot of plants can tolerate that high pH. But let's go back to swamps. Now, a lot of times we think a swamp, technically we think of the Everland, we think of the Everglades. We think of this kind of mushy, smelly, stagnant water. But technically, a swamp consists of lots of tall trees, shrubs. Louisiana are some great examples of swamps. Technically, what most of the places that we may see in Florida, which has the tall grasses, they are actually not swamps. Those are actually marshes. So, if we think of a swamp, you have to think of the woody plants, such as trees and shrubs. Water many times flows through. It's slow moving, a little more stagnant than what a river would be, but it is slow moving. Marshes, no woody plants, soft stem grasses and plants, and this is going to be more stagnant. And then bogs, pretty much just mosses. Now let's talk about groundwater. Groundwater is water contained in open underground. Groundwater is water contained in the open underground spaces or pores of soil and rock. And we talked about what this ground that holds water is called. That's called an aquifer. So an aquifer can be considered an open aquifer or a closed aquifer. Another name for an open aquifer is called an unconfined aquifer. This is when the water may rain, hit the ground, and then seep through the pores and come to the bottom. Now, as it continues to rain, the water will rise, and reach the surface, and then it can cause flooding. That is an unconfined aquifer. It is connected from the bottom to the surface above. Now, a confined aquifer is actually a body of soil or ground that is trapped between perhaps bedrock and clay. So we have two impermeable substances on the top and bottom between the aquifer. So somehow this clay trapped this aquifer. Let's dissect the aquifer. The aquifer consists of two zones, the zone of aeration and the zone of saturation. Now, the zone of aeration is just basically the aquifer that is not filled with water. So the spaces or the pores between the soil particles is not filled with water. But when it rains, and if any part of that aquifer is filled with water, those spaces are saturated with water. They're filled with water. So that is called the zone of saturation. So as you can see in the picture, all the parts that are covered blue would be called the zone of saturation. Now you can see above the blue in the unconfined aquifer, the one that can react to the surface, the part above that, that's brown, that's the part of the soil that is dry. It's the zone of aeration. Here's a big hint. Those spaces, they're empty, right? There's no water in the zone of aeration. What's filling those spaces? Air. So the zone of aeration is filled with air. Now you can actually look at this picture and you can see the confined aquifer. So the confined aquifer is trapped between the bedrock and the clay. Can any of the water in the confined aquifer reach the surface? No, it can't. Only the water in the unconfined aquifer, when it rains, could rise and fill the surface. So technically, when someone wants to build a well, they're going to drill down and they want to access as much of that aquifer as possible so that when the water does drop, it can still be in range of the well. Now, here's one more term, and that term is the water table. What the water table is, it's just the top of the zone of saturation. So if we have a drought and the zone of saturation drops, well, so does the water table. So the top of the zone of saturation, that's the water table. As the water table rises, well, maybe it's raining consistently. The aquifer is going to be filled with water, so the zone of saturation is going to rise. Well, that's what's happening. The water table is going to rise. Can the water table reach the surface? Yeah. If the complete aquifer is filled and there's flooding, the water table would be at the surface. Here's an illustration in a picture showing you the two zones as well as the water table. You can see where the water table is versus the zone of aeration and zone of saturation. Okay, here's our last slide. We talked about this briefly. What is hard water? Hard water is referring to water that has a high mineral content. If you've ever gone to a hotel and took a shower, and after you took your shower you feel kind of grimy, you don't really feel clean, that's because that water had a lot of minerals consisting of perhaps calcium or magnesium.